Let's get real. Welcome to TBC Today. This podcast features friends in and around the Triad Baptist Church community. Hear encouraging real-life stories from our weekly guests and inspiring insights from our host, Pastor Rob. To learn more about Triad Baptist Church in Kernersville, North Carolina, visit us online at tbcnow.org.
Welcome to this episode of TBC Today. Now we're doing something a little bit different because we're sort of in the mode of missions, coming right off of our missions conference a few weeks ago, and we have a special guest with us today that is not with us, but that we're going to talk to via Zoom. So hopefully if you're listening, you'll hear this really well, and if you're watching, you'll also see the little picture. But we've got with us Jim Bowers, and Jim is married to Stacy. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, his wife. But both he and Stacy grew up with missionary parents, grew up in missionary families in the Amazon region of Brazil. So, Pastor Rob, are you ready to start this conversation?
I'm ready to start it.
All right, let's get real.
Okay, Jim, one thing I want you to know is we have here the sands of time. And so we always do that as our timer to keep us on track here. But let me just mention a little bit here. I'm not just coming in cold turkey with Jim. He and I have a history. We went to Piedmont Bible College together, and we were both in the aviation program. And so I've known him for quite some time. And so we got to know each other really well when we went through a mechanics program, AMP, Airframe and Power Plant. And we got to where we could kill each other and be best friends at the same time. It was kind of a crazy time in my life. What did we have, 18 months, I think, together every day of our life, except Sunday. And so it was wild. But your friend was Bauk. You remember Bauk used to sit by you? And, oh, man, that was some days. One day the kid fell asleep. He was crazy. He was a crazy kid. Anyways, he fell asleep, and we tried to see how many Cheetos we could get on his lip while he was still asleep, and we had them all over his lips and everything. We had a lot of fun back then. We've grown up now, I guess you could say. But anyways, Jim, it's so good to have you, man. I'm just excited about your ministry and what you've done.
And feel free to tell stories about Pastor Rob, too.
Don't feel too free.
Well, I noticed you have the sands of time up there that look like a 2-hour timer. So
That's actually a 30-minute timer. It's going fast. Right. Okay, but anyways, let's kind of start with you came to Piedmont. You had an intention to go into missions. Just start right there and tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. 10 months old, my parents went their first time to the Amazon, and that's where I spent all my years growing up, except for a couple of furloughs in Michigan. And then I wasn't sure what I should do next after high school, but I felt God calling me to be in missions, but wasn't sure where that would be, and thought maybe I'd go back and help my dad. He was a bush pilot there in the Amazon, in the border of Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. And so, not knowing where to train, my dad trained at Moody Bible Institute. That was an option, but he was going to spend a year before going back to Brazil to teach at Piedmont. So I moved with them from Michigan and North Carolina to start my first year there. Rob, you and I met there just the next year. You were already there, but I was on campus the first year, and the second year is when we did the A&P part. I passed the flight camp and was thinking I would be a missionary pilot, but that's not how it ended up. So I did get my mechanics license and worked in the military and civil airliners and general aviation and some on the mission field with other airplanes, but not as a missionary pilot. The Lord led Ronnie and I together, my wife there, who I met at Piedmont, and we dated for the 4 years and then married and joined the military to get the GI Bill to do the flying. As you know, Rob, that's not the cheap part. And the Lord worked out a lot of interesting things. I don't want to spend too much time, but just to say that I had planned to be a missionary pilot, thought that's what God was calling me to, but when I got out of the 5 years in the Army in Germany, was going to finish my course. I found out that the Army would pay me, but they'll pay me over the next 4 years. And the training at Piedmont was for 1 year of flying. And basically through consultation with my dad, who said there's other ways to do the ministry back there in the Amazon, doesn't have to be with an airplane. And I didn't want to go into debt, so decided not to do that part, but continued to finish my degree in a different thing, but not with missionary aviation. So that worked out great. And Ronnie was able to get a second degree, and we headed to the mission field. And where we went wasn't Brazil. It was the Amazon. We decided when we did our training there at Piedmont to do a trip that was where I wanted to go, but not the exact same place. So we went to the Amazon of Peru, nearby where I grew up.
Well, your ministry was so unique. because you kind of created it. And tell a little bit about that, like ending up on that boat.
It
That
may seem
Incredible
like
story right there.
yeah, may seem like we created it, but another Piedmont student, and you may have known Len Porter. You remember her?
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
she was already, her parents were already doing that kind of ministry, and so were others who were traveling a 300-mile stretch of the Amazon River, basically from the gateway town of Iquitos, Peru, where people that want to go to the Amazon of Peru will fly into that city and then go up downriver toward the border of Brazil and Colombia, where I grew up. So it's a 300-mile stretch of river that we were very blessed to have missionaries that went before us, and they had 72 preaching points, as in not 72 churches, but that was the goal, is to establish churches in all those different river villages. And so Ronnie and I were able to follow up and continue the Porters ministry as they retired. And they were just really good and showing us the ropes as we traveled with them. And then we built a boat and lived aboard for the next 6 years.
when you said you built a boat, how do you do that? I mean, like, it's a houseboat, right?
So one thing that helped a lot is I grew up down there and wasn't intimidated by certain things about life on the river. And then we had I think the thing that God used the most to lead us into that was we had the Porter's boat given to us, but it was not what we wanted. And so we started imagining something better and came up with a plan. And there was a certain naval architect said, I could design you something as far as the hull. And then I had the idea of designing the rest of it. So it ended up being a 60-foot, like you would see in the States, a houseboat, two large pontoons. And it was built basically, the first part was built in Muskegon, Michigan and Elkhart, Indiana by people that build motorhomes. I had different wall panels and roof panels fabricated. We put them in containers, sent them down, and all the aluminum that a welder put welded there. So what was interesting is that we spent about 6 months building this boat, waiting for the water to rise. And when it rose, it floated properly, and we were on our way. So we built it on the banks of the Amazon, and Lord really blessed how all that came together.
And so, even is that in your psyche, like as a kid? I mean, do you almost feel this? Let's do something kind of different than most missionaries. There's not many missionaries who do houseboat living.
Well, I think a lot of it probably has to do with that I grew up there. But it wasn't in Peru, and it was with Portuguese instead of Spanish, but it was home to me. And I was going home, and I had the feel for life there. And I saw a big part was these other missionaries living on their boats. Even growing up in Brazil, my dad supported two of our missionaries that we supported, had that kind of ministry. They didn't live full time in their boat, but they would go for months at a time on river trips. So I saw that. I was with them. So I had a lot of background. Building a boat wasn't really my background, but it was an aluminum boat. And I had just finished 5 years of military aluminum aviation, and also with Temco there in Greensboro. So I had a lot of experience with using aluminum. So that was part of it too.
Like you were welding a little.
No, riveting. And the
Riveting.
welding was done by a welder who spent 3 months with us, a professional welder that did the hull and the deck. And then the rest was all screwed and rivets and just lots of things with wood and aluminum combination.
Remember when we used to do aluminum welding there in A&P, and the aluminum would disappear. If you got it too hot, it was gone.
Right. And that's one place where we spent money. We had an electrician and a welder, and we hired a welder to go to Peru for 3 months. So you can imagine what that would cost. But
Wow.
he was doing it as a ministry, but we did compensate him. And so I learned, I had a lot more experience than you did in the end there, Rob, because I built a 60-foot boat, welding the whole deck, all the decks, or the hull, both the hulls, the decks, and lots of welding going on.
And you riveted, and you did the riveting and everything too.
Yes. Well, the riveting, actually, most of that part was screws, aluminum screws and nuts and bolts.
Okay.
When I said riveting, I was thinking of the hulls, but then realized we didn't rivet that together. That was all welded.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so how long did you do that? How long were you on the houseboat?
We would have, our intention was to stay there till we retired. My parents were in, and most of the older generation were into that. You moved there, that was your life. And still, I know quite a number of missionaries in Peru that are debating now whether they should stay in Peru to retire or go back to the States. And that was our intention until God had other plans. We had been doing that ministry for about 5.5 years when God took Ronnie and Charity home through the accident that I'm sure you want me to share a little bit about. But I could have returned there, and I did numerous times for follow-up, but not to live there with Corey, our 6-year-old. So that ended that phase of our ministry, although I've been connected off and on over the years, visits and supporting different ministries.
Was it effective? Was that an effective way to reach people for the gospel?
I would say, and my dad passed away early on before we got to Peru from cancer, and would have been very, very good for him to see. The counsel he gave me was very good, because missionary aviation is necessary. And I would say around the world, that would be one area, because there's no roads in those remote places and a lot of population in the jungle. So that's one place where the airplane is very effective, but as effective or more so to live with people and have the medical equipment aboard, library, and lots of things that we were able to do, not because we were trained or have expertise in any of that, just because we were there and had the supplies and the willingness to be with the people. So it was very effective to live among the people that way.
That's cool.
Tell us a little bit about your wife and your kids, your family.
I'm not hearing your audio.
You talking about his first wife, or are you talking about now?
Yeah.
Your first wife. Tell us a little about Ronnie and your kids.
She hadn't been overseas, well, unless you call Hawaii. She was 4 years in Hawaii as a military brat, and came to Piedmont at 17 years old, and we met that year. And so we didn't get married right away, but she was quite young when we met, and we didn't claim to be boyfriend, girlfriend for the first year, but the Lord had other plans. And she was coming to Piedmont wanting to be a missionary. And she even said that someone suggested maybe check out the guys on the soccer team, because a lot of MKs, and also aviation. So she was right from the beginning kind of trying to think of who would she go to the mission field with. I don't know that she would have gone on her by herself, but she was very ambitious and capable, and but quite young. And she met an MK and was quite interested in what I had in mind. And so it seemed like everything fit together very good from the beginning. She was an excellent student, got straight A's and 2 degrees there at Piedmont. And I don't know what her legacy was there when she left, but she was well known before what happened in Peru.
Yeah. Okay, and so tell us a little bit about what happened where, you were. Tell us that story in the Amazon where you got shot.
Right. Some of your listeners may remember about 21 years ago, seeing in the news a report of the Peruvian Air Force shooting down a missionary plane in the Amazon of Peru, and that was our plane, our missions plane. And another one of your college friends, Kevin Donaldson, was the pilot, and he was wounded and almost, actually, I don't know how much of the news got out about him almost dying from loss of blood, and just was very close to death there in the jungle. They evacuated him, and many surgeries later, he's been able to walk and is back in ministry, and we've had ongoing contact. But we were taking a trip out of the country to take our adopted daughter, who we just brought back from the States, Charity, who was 8 months old, to be registered in Peru as a with the visa to be allowed to be there with us. And so we had to leave the country and come back in. So I asked Kevin if he'd take us to the border, which was the 2-hour flight. Takes 4 days in our boat, 4 like 24-hour days. And so that wasn't much of an option. There were other ways, but he was glad to do that. One interesting thing is that he just got the plane back in the air with a brand new engine, and not a rebuilt engine. Someone offered to pay for a brand new engine, had like 6 hours on it. So he was back in the air, a brand new paint job and work that him and I had done on the plane to get it ready for work, with a new plan for how he's going to take Peruvian pastors into the bush, and lots of interesting things. So on our way back from where we had been in Colombia, but we had based the plane had spent the night at the hangar where my dad had his airplanes there in Brazil. And on the way back, we saw an Air Force plane pass us, which was the very first time I've seen that. It'd be fine if it was off in the distance, but it zoomed past very closely with a flasher on the top, like a police car had the flashers on. And supposedly they were calling us, and I guess they did, but they were calling us on a frequency that Kevin had no idea what was going on. And he was supposed to have been to Lima twice a year, a big imposition for him. For the last several years, he was supposed to have been there for briefings to make sure he stayed out of the way during the drug war. And him and one other pilot were the only 2 that operated in the area, that were based there. So it was a huge negligence on both the CIA and the Peruvian Air Force's part for not including Kevin in on that, what they were required to have done. So Kevin didn't have a clue what frequency they might have been calling him on, and what he was supposed to do. So he did nothing. He continued where we had the flight plan. As the news said, for the first 2 weeks, there was no flight plan, but there was a flight plan. The people at our receiving end at the airport we were flying to, we didn't land. It was a float plane, but we were heading back to the city of Iquitos, and they knew we were coming. So everything was legitimate. And then they started shooting. And to this day, we still think there's something up it hasn't been resolved yet, 21 years later, that something required them to shoot us then and ask questions later. It wasn't a case of they thought we may have drugs and that we were getting away, as they tried to say up till now. They keep saying that they was just sorry, you were the wrong people we were after. Makes no sense. But anyway, the bullets that came into the plane, and someone counted them later, it was over 40 bullet holes that came into the plane. They hit Kevin in both of his legs, and then Ronnie in her back, and one of the bullets that hit her went through Charity's head. And I was in the front seat with Kevin, and Corey was behind me. Neither one of us were hit, but there were two holes in the windshield right in front of our face, which all that came from behind and below us, and holes through the instrument panel. And there's a propeller at our mission right now that has in the root of the prop a hole that goes all the way through it, and that came through the engine. And so all that was just ripping the plane apart, and Corey and I were spared any bullets. And the plane was on fire, and we were going down from about 4,000 feet in a steep, much steeper than I have ever experienced in an airplane. Kevin just basically pointed the airplane down. And I wasn't thinking this was time for like a crash landing. It just seemed like it was like time to explode or something. It was hard to say what I was thinking, but there was fire in the plane. So God allowed, having been working on that plane and seeing that there was a tiny fire extinguisher, I'd asked Kevin about, like, why so tiny? Is this actually going to work? I didn't realize that not long later I'd be using it to keep the fire at bay that was coming through the floorboards, because there was a fuel line that had ruptured and was on fire, and it kept coming as I sprayed it out and come back in. And that was threatening us, of course. A lot of smoke. We had the windows open, and I don't remember at all anything about Ronnie and Charity's condition. I just know that Corey was coughing, and I told him to keep his head out the window, which you can imagine in a plane, that's unusual. And then noticing the river ahead, one of the small tributaries that Kevin seemed to be shooting for, and just making it over the trees and crash landing in the river. We were in the water for about 45 minutes. We're fortunate or able to see the CIA spy plane up high. Find out later that was at 10,000 feet circling, watching the whole thing, and they had all this on video. And everybody can see the video a couple months later on C-SPAN. That was after the CIA threatened us not to ever speak of the video or anything about them, and for possible perjury if we do. And then it's on C-SPAN, and everybody can see it now on YouTube, of the CIA watching the whole thing happen and approving of it until the last minute. They say they were trying to call it off. So we were picked up by people in a village that actually they weren't from that village, but they took us there. And that's one place that we had been a few months before. It's one of our churches that we were trying to start. And the story is quite interesting, what happened there, but I don't know if you have any questions based on what I said so far.
So Ronnie got shot in the back. The little one got shot where?
In the head.
Yeah, well, I took them both out of the plane. I don't remember how I did that. We were in the water for about 45 minutes, and I had them with me, and they were dead. And she had a hole in her forehead, actually in her back of her head, and the bullet was sticking out her forehead. It was still there, the bullet. And that must have been the one that went through the middle of Ronnie. She had several other wounds, but that was it seemed apparent, and she would have been holding Charity right there. So
did you go into shock yourself?
I can't say, because I don't remember a lot of details. I did at the time because I was interviewed. It was actually quite a blessing to have the police and the Air Force and the embassy staff come to see me that night and the next morning. And it was awful, but it was also good that they kept asking questions, because it caused me to repeat things. Things are recorded by them, and me having said them, and Corey some of the time in the hotel room during all those interrogations.
You mean for your memory's sake now?
Yeah, it's just good that I had these people coming to investigate. A lot of fascinating things. I don't think hardly anyone knows that I was the one able to get to the shortwave radio in the village. It wasn't our radio, though we had donated one. It was one that was already there. Was able to make a radio phone patch to the pilot's wife, Bobby Donaldson, who is the one who was able to pass the word on, because it was basically her word back to our mission and to parents and relatives and the U.S. authorities against what the CIA and the Peruvian Air Force, who continued for weeks and even till this day, denying, not totally denying, but trying to get out of it. So I was the survivor in the plane that got the word out, of all things. It wasn't like local news, because there wasn't such a thing, or anybody else that would have been able to get the news out. It was myself that God allowed me to think, well, this town I think has a radio. They led me to a radio that worked. And within a few minutes, I had the pilot's wife on the line telling her to definitely pray for her husband, who we weren't thinking was going to make it.
Yeah.
Now, is your personality, like when you look back over that now, here all these years later, is it like you just kind of go through the motions, or do you actually start feeling this, or did the feelings come way later?
And somewhat later, yeah, because it was so much going on. It's not a typical. I thought many times about a typical death where someone were to have a disease and they died over time, or something that happened that's kind of normal, right? Even a car crash or something. In this case, there was so many unknowns, including the two DEA agents that showed up at that village. They were with the Peruvian Air Force that flew in a big float plane, a twin otter, that brought in about 15 soldiers who were told the CIA. I have contact till today with the two young DEA agents, Americans, who said that they had to be ready because they were chasing down drug runners, and that was 6 hours after the crash, after everybody in the world knew what happened and that who we were and that there were no drugs or any of that. They were still sent out chasing drug runners, and when they found Corey and I in the bodies sitting there and wondered what's this all about and where's the pilot and all that. So the Peruvian Air Force in charge didn't want them to speak to me in English, but we had this conversation. So they took us, when we got to the city, the Air Force flew us back, and with the bodies, they took us in their car, Corey and I, on a fast pace getaway basically through the city and hit us. Then they allowed the police to come, and they kind of took charge. And it was just a big relief to us to see that there was someone defending us, because we were thinking we could be in big trouble. Maybe drugs were planted on our plane, and we could easily be in jail and all kinds of problems, where we had these two guys that were defending us, and it was quite a part of the adventure there. But for me to be thinking about what happened to Ronnie and Charity and all this, there wasn't a lot of time, or there was time, but it just, I guess maybe you say I was in shock or denial or something, but I didn't give the ramifications of all this that much thought in those first days.
But you did give thought to the fact that you could you're being hunted, and you're relieved that they're getting you away
From that.
Well, I knew for a fact I was innocent, but that doesn't mean that in a country like Peru, they were chasing us down and actually shooting us out of the air, and drugs aboard or something, that I couldn't be in a big problem. And as it was, embassy people were coming to see us in Iquitos, got us on the next plane out, and all that. So we were fine. And so that was a big relief. And then there was plenty. Here's something that makes a big difference if you lose your loved ones, is to have everybody in the world interested and concerned and praying, and know that you didn't do anything wrong, and just a whole lot of other things that went along with it. It wasn't just the loss of Ronnie and Charity.
Yeah. You have a thought?
Well, so I mean, just fast forward a little bit. How did you meet Stacy, and then what was the next phase of your ministry?
I didn't hear the last part. Your audio's cutting out. But how did I meet Stacy and what?
And then kind of what was the next phase of your ministry? How did you pick up and move forward?
I didn't hear that. Sorry, I'm not sure why your audio's not making it in here.
All right. So the next phase of your ministry. Okay.
Let's keep moving. That's good, because the book that was written about this and published by Moody and sold lots of copies didn't mention anything about Stacy. And so Stacy and I were very good friends growing up, and her dad was a missionary pilot as well with MAF, and we were friends at boarding school and family friends. And she was in Portugal listening to CNN, BBC, and other things about this fellow she knew. She called my mom in North Carolina, but when she did, I was there by then. And so after they talked, I was on the phone with her. So a couple of days after the crash, we spoke, and then it wasn't obvious at that moment, but wasn't too long where it seemed obvious to both of us that she had been single, wondering why she was still single as a missionary in Portugal. And so, in fact, at boarding school, there was a prohibition against dating. So we never dated, but we did like each other a lot and stayed in contact. She met Stacy, Stacy met Ronnie, stayed in Ronnie's dorm there at Piedmont when she visited us. And so we've been somewhat in contact, although I guess it had been maybe 15 years since the last time I spoke to her when she did call from Portugal. And then within a couple of years, we were married and moving on in ministry. We went back to Portugal, but we knew that wasn't the place for us to stay, considering Stacy had her ministry and she was the leader of lots of things. And Portugal was a readjustment for me to get back into Portuguese. So we were looking for somewhere else, Portuguese or Spanish speaking, to minister together. And the Lord brought us took us to Mozambique, where we worked for 9 years there.
Yeah, Mozambique. Wow. Where'd you go in Mozambique? What town?
Well, the capital city, and both of us were used to the bush and the interior and all that, but we ended up in the capital working with youth and started an adventure camp using sailing there. We sailed the kids to a remote spot where we had an adventure camp and a number of other things over the 9 years.
Yeah, and who was that with? Just an independent organization, or?
Okay, what happened with us going to Mozambique is that we told our churches they wouldn't have to continue supporting us because of what happened with President Bush and the State Department and the settlement with us. And so we were able to live independently. We went looking for a team to join, and I had the preference of joining local people and not necessarily sent. We were sent by a church in the States, but not with a mission agency or with funding. And so we joined the Youth for Christ people. It seemed to be the best fit for us, and we were with them for a couple of years. And with the help of missionaries in Portugal, started our own mission board there in Mozambique. And it'd be another half hour to tell you why we left Mozambique. But we ended up in Maryland for a couple of years for a transition to go back overseas. There, we decided to continue in sailing ministry. Instead of having a home, we lived aboard the boat for 4 years. 2 of those were in Maryland. And then we sailed to Puerto Rico by way of Canada because we hadn't seen Maine yet. We were told as sailors we need to sail in Maine in the summer. We did that and then sailed down the coast and over to the DR looking to see if that were we skipped Cuba knowing that to use sailing there would have been too complicated and it's really not easy to do any ministry there yet. And DR, after a few weeks there, checking that out, ended up in Puerto Rico and felt quite clearly God would have us stay there long term.
This sailing is like a big old schooner, like this big old sailboat.
Yeah, schooners.
No motor.
There's a motor, yeah, but well, it's big enough that you wouldn't want to try to sail out of your dock and back into a dock and all that, and go when there's no wind and all that. So there is an engine, but it's not a schooner rig. That's a different kind of sailing rig. It's a sloop and good size. People ask, is it a big boat? And yes and no, because we've seen plenty of them that are larger than ours. It's a 49-foot 3-cabin cruising sailboat.
Well, you called it a ministry. What kind of ministry would you have on a sailboat?
So what we did in Mozambique is where we got started with that. The ministry in Peru wasn't a boating ministry. That was our transportation and our home. In Mozambique, though, it was to take young people out on adventures to our camp and to ended up being anybody that wanted to get on the water. We had like lots of opportunities for one-on-one or groups and camping and fishing, lots of things. So that's what we were going to try to do in the Chesapeake, but it was seasonal. We only had about 7 months and there was less interest. Although a lot of our our 2 girls who were raised in Africa had a lot to talk about when they got to Maryland. They live on a boat, come from Africa, speak Portuguese fluently and all that stuff. And it was easy for them to make friends because of the boat. So kind of like family interactions, but then in Puerto Rico, it's been much more because we've been doing father-son retreats and youth retreats. And then we have a ministry where we host pastors and missionaries and they come for a week or 2 or longer for free. And then we have them, I take them out on the boat. It's usually just me because it's often during school, but the family has also as a family, we take people. But if I have a pastor and his wife and I'm the only crew, it makes it very comfortable for that 49-foot sailing yacht to spend time in the Virgin Islands, the Spanish Virgin Islands, U.S. and British Virgin Islands, doing nothing and getting them out in the nature and do fishing and they stay aboard and all that. So it's a great tool.
And what is the purpose of that again?
The purpose, actually, we're not counselors. Stacy and I weren't trained in counseling. But in Mozambique, Lord had given us the former slave quarters, basically, as overnight for people going into the interior. And so we were like the overflow guest house for ministry there. And that's what gave us the idea to do that in Puerto Rico. So when we decided to buy a house there, we worked on how it would work to have a separate place for guests and to host. And no, so we're not counselors, but the idea is to just let them talk and to share. And we have a lot of common experiences in ministry. So it's worked out really well. Lots of good comments about how we hosted in the sense that we just help them feel at home and they can do their own thing and kind of orient them to the island and doing things like that.
Yeah. So how do they find out about that ministry? Is there a site you have, or?
We decided not to. It's different than what we had in Mozambique, which was transient people. We didn't have to impress anybody because all we had is a lodge for them to stay the night. And we got comments of people saying how much of a blessing that was for them. And we thought, let's do it again on the side as we do these other ministries and see how the Lord blesses as far as sending people our way. So it's always been word of mouth, and we've continued that way. And I guess this way too. It's not been many of these interviews that go into a podcast, but it's mostly been a pastor or some mission leader who passes the word on to. We always want to have someone referred to us. So like if one of your guests here or one of in the audience were to call us, and I guess they could say you referred them, maybe, Pastor. But what we're trying to get is a pastor or a good friend of ours that says, here's someone that really needs this, and then they recommend that we take them, and that's how it's worked, and it's gone really well.
Okay, good. Well, we're almost out of time here. We are out of time, but let me ask you, just as you look over your life now, Jim, 21 years ago, that tragedy happened. I know you can't figure it all out, but what do you feel like the path that God cut out for you? How do you see it from God's perspective? Like, do you have make any sense of the path?
Okay, so I've read a lot and been very interested in God's sovereignty and how he allows bad things to happen to people. So there was a lot of that going on at the beginning as I searched why. I never had the sense from the very beginning that that to be mad at God or to question, how could he have done this to me, considering that was Ronnie's best day, Charity's too, and they went on to be in his presence, and that wasn't a tragedy as everybody was saying. Of course, to Corey and myself and others, it was very difficult. But the homegoing of a believer is quite different. And that's how God gave me that understanding. Now, I've also been prone. I have lots of needs spiritually, but one strength I feel I have is I've been prone to think of when we do ministry and we talk about the Lord, everything should be God focused, and we're too human focused. And so God just give me that idea that he's the one that's going to decide on all these things, like he did with Ron and Charity in our time in Peru. So just to be more conscious of God's sovereignty and in control.
So even in your ministry, like on the sailboat, you literally, that's what you try to do, keep God focused on
These people's lives.
Yes, yeah, we do have retreats where we have a Bible study or teaching time, and lots of things that have to do with that. Yeah, and so then I often the things that are meaningful to me are what I bring up as a theme, and we talk about. And then when it's with the counseling for pastors and missionaries, it's whatever they want to talk about, but the conversation oftentimes gets to that theme. Yeah. I want to mention something about how to find out about coming as a pastor or missionary to stay free and enjoy a cruise, and is contact Triad Baptist Church and ask them about it, and pastor will interview you and see if he'll do the job vetting you for us.
Yeah. Perfect. That's perfect. Well, this has been really great. We appreciate you talking to us today on this episode.
Didn't hear that again.
Well, I'm closing out. All right. This has been a really great episode. We appreciate you being here with us as a guest. I know it's a little difficult when you're doing Zoom, but we appreciate the story and would encourage you to visit our website, tbcnow.org, if you'd like to learn more about our missions program here at the church. All right, Pastor Rob, I think that's it.
That's good. Hey, buddy, thank you for your time, and thank you for doing this. We may do it again sometime just to expand on it further, but we appreciate
Thanks for joining us this
doing.
week on TBC Today. We want to connect with you, so make sure to visit our website, tbcnow.org, and subscribe, rate, and review the show in iTunes, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Don't forget to share this episode with a friend, and be on the lookout for our next conversation.